Sometimes the poorest-looking man in the courtroom is carrying the richest secret no one is prepared to believe. The clerk barely looked up as Ethan Brooks stepped through the courthouse doors wearing worn work boots, faded jeans, and a charcoal mechanic shirt with a stitched name patch that still smelled faintly of motor oil. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, reflecting across polished stone floors where polished shoes echoed with quiet confidence. Ethan's footsteps sounded different, slower, heavier, not because he feared what waited ahead, but because every step marked the end of a marriage he had once believed would last forever. Tucked beneath one arm was a thin folder containing the last documents needed to finalize his divorce. There were no expensive attorneys surrounding him, no assistants carrying leather briefcases, no photographers waiting outside. Just a father who had finished replacing a transmission before sunrise so he could make it to court on time. Across the lobby, Victoria Hale adjusted the cuff of her tailored navy blazer as members of her legal team gathered around her. At 37, she had built one of America's fastest-growing automotive corporations, and every room seemed to shift the moment she entered it. Her confidence wasn't loud. It was precise, practiced, and sharpened by years of winning. She accepted a folder from her attorney without breaking stride, but her attention drifted when a loose sheet slipped from Ethan's file and landed across the polished floor. One of her associates bent to retrieve it before glancing down at the page. His eyebrows lifted slightly. "Looks like the mechanic doesn't have much to divide," he murmured with an amused smile. Victoria accepted the paper, her eyes scanning the financial disclosure. An aging repair garage, a modest pickup truck, basic savings, old equipment. She allowed herself a quiet laugh that never rose above a whisper. "Some people spend an entire lifetime building almost nothing," she said, handing the page back without another thought. Ethan had heard every word. He simply thanked the associate for returning the document, straightened the corner carefully, and placed it back into his folder with steady hands. He never defended himself. He never looked embarrassed. Instead, he offered the same calm expression he wore while solving problems beneath the hood of a classic engine that everyone else had already given up on. As Victoria disappeared toward the private elevators reserved for executives and corporate counsel, an elderly courthouse security officer paused beside Ethan and greeted him with unexpected warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Brooks," he said respectfully. Ethan smiled. "Morning, Frank. How's your granddaughter enjoying college?" The old man's weathered face brightened instantly. "Dean's List again. She still talks about that scholarship." Ethan nodded gently. "She earned every bit of it." Victoria slowed for only a second, puzzled by the exchange. The scholarship program Frank mentioned had quietly paid full tuition to dozens of struggling students over the past decade, yet its anonymous founder had never revealed his identity. Before she could wonder any further, a sharply dressed banker entered through the revolving doors, stopped abruptly upon seeing Ethan, and lowered his voice with unmistakable respect. "Mr. Brooks," he said softly, "the Overseas Board has confirmed tomorrow's call. They said they'll work around your schedule." Ethan answered with the same humble tone he used for everyone else. "Thank you. Tomorrow afternoon should be fine. I have to pick up Lily from school first." The banker nodded without hesitation and walked away. Victoria frowned. None of it made sense. Why would an international banker wait for the convenience of a small-town mechanic whose divorce papers suggested a man with almost nothing? As Ethan quietly continued toward courtroom 4B, carrying the same weathered folder beneath his arm, Victoria found herself watching him a moment longer than she intended, unaware that the man she had dismissed less than a minute earlier possessed a fortune so carefully hidden that even the public records she trusted had never come close to revealing the truth. Ethan Brooks left the courthouse just after 11 o'clock, not with relief, but with the quiet acceptance that some chapters ended long before the paperwork ever did. The summer sun hung high above Maple Street as he climbed into his faded blue pickup truck, the driver's seat carrying the familiar scent of leather, coffee, and years of honest work. Before turning the key, he glanced at the photograph clipped beside the visor. Lily smiled back with missing front teeth and bright blue eyes, proudly holding the small wooden birdhouse they had built together the previous spring. That smile reminded him why every difficult choice had been worth making. 20 minutes later, he pulled into Brooks Auto Repair, a modest two-bay garage tucked beside an aging brick warehouse, where the American flag fluttered gently above the entrance. The hand-painted sign had faded over the years, but customers still trusted the name beneath it because Ethan had never believed in cutting corners. Inside, the familiar sounds welcomed him home. An air compressor released a steady hiss. A socket wrench clicked against steel. Country music drifted softly from an old radio balanced on a shelf above neatly organized tools. The scent of fresh motor oil mixed with warm rubber and polished chrome, creating a place that felt more like home than any house ever had. His longtime employee, Ben Morales, looked up from beneath the hood of a silver Chevrolet Silverado and smiled. "Everything finished?" he asked. Ethan nodded once. Everything that needed finishing. Ben understood without another question. They had worked together for nearly 12 years, and silence often carried more meaning than conversation. Before either man could return to work, the front office door opened, and a young mother stepped inside carrying the hand of a little boy no older than 6. She looked nervous as she approached the counter. "I know this is embarrassing," she said softly, "but my transmission started slipping this morning, and I cannot pay until next Friday. If I miss work again, I might lose my job." Ethan walked around the counter, accepted her keys, and offered the same calm smile he gave every customer. "We will get you back on the road today." Tears gathered in the woman's eyes. "But I told you I cannot pay yet." Ethan shook his head gently. "I heard you the first time. Your son needs you at work more than I need a receipt today." The little boy looked up with wide eyes. "Really?" Ethan crouched to meet him at eye level. "Really? But you have to promise me something." The child nodded eagerly. "Study hard, help your mom, and someday when someone else needs kindness, you pass it along." The boy grinned and held out his tiny hand. Ethan shook it as though sealing the most important business agreement of the day. While Ben rolled the vehicle into the service bay, Ethan quietly slipped the repair invoice into a drawer marked deferred accounts. It was already thick with unpaid bills he had never expected to collect. Across town, Victoria Hale sat inside the glass conference room on the 32nd floor of Hale Automotive Holdings reviewing acquisition reports for independent repair shops throughout the state. One address immediately caught her attention: Brooks Auto Repair. The recommendation from her expansion team was simple: purchase the property, close the garage, and replace it with a premium certified service center. Victoria signed the preliminary authorization without hesitation. To her, it was another efficient business decision. She had no way of knowing that the modest garage she had just approved for acquisition held connections reaching far beyond oil changes, brake repairs, and worn-out engines, or that its quiet owner had already changed more lives than any balance sheet could ever measure. 3 mornings later, the first hint of change arrived not with lawyers or executives, but with a black luxury sedan that rolled quietly into the gravel parking lot of Brooks Auto Repair just after 8 o'clock. Ethan was finishing an oil change on an aging Ford Explorer when the unfamiliar vehicle came to a stop beside the service bay. The driver stepped out first, wearing an immaculate gray suit despite the summer heat. He opened the rear passenger door with practiced precision. Victoria Hale emerged, her sunglasses reflecting the morning sunlight and the rows of weathered tool cabinets that lined the garage wall. Everything about the place stood in contrast to the sleek headquarters she had left behind. The concrete floor showed years of honest use. Ceiling fans turned lazily above shelves filled with carefully labeled parts. The smell of fresh coffee drifted from the tiny office while the steady rhythm of an impact wrench echoed through the building like a familiar heartbeat. Ethan looked up only long enough to recognize his unexpected visitor before calmly returning to the wheel assembly in front of him. "Good morning," he said without changing his pace. "Someone will be with you in just a minute." Victoria studied him for a moment, surprised that he showed no sign of nervousness or excitement. Most business owners became noticeably anxious when the chief executive officer of Hale Automotive Holdings walked through their doors. Ethan simply tightened another lug nut with measured precision before setting the wrench aside and wiping his hands on a clean shop towel. "How can I help you today?" he asked. Victoria removed her sunglasses and looked around the modest garage. "I am here because my company has made an offer on this property." Ethan nodded once. "I heard rumors. The location fits our expansion plan," she continued. "A modern certified service center would generate considerably more revenue than an independent repair shop." Ethan listened quietly. "You are free to make an offer," he replied. That does not mean I have to sell. One of Victoria's attorneys stepped forward carrying a polished leather folder. Mr. Brooks, this proposal exceeds current market value by nearly 40%. Most owners would sign immediately. Ethan accepted the folder politely but did not open it. Instead, he placed it carefully on the counter beside an old coffee mug decorated with Lily's hand-painted flowers. Then perhaps you should present it to most owners, he answered with a gentle smile. This garage is not for sale. The attorney exchanged a puzzled glance with Victoria. She had expected negotiation, perhaps hesitation, certainly curiosity about the number printed on the first page. Instead, she found quiet certainty that could not be measured in dollars. Before she could respond, the low rumble of another engine drifted into the parking lot. A deep red Ferrari, restored to flawless condition, eased toward the service entrance. Every employee instinctively looked up. The driver, a distinguished man in his late 60s, stepped out wearing an understated navy sport coat. The moment he saw Ethan, his face brightened with genuine respect. "Good to see you again, sir," he said warmly. Ethan smiled and shook his hand. "Welcome back, Charles. How is your granddaughter enjoying her first year at Stanford?" Charles laughed softly. "She still says none of it would have happened without your advice." Victoria noticed something unusual. Charles was not merely being polite. His admiration was sincere, almost personal. As Ethan walked with him toward the office, Charles lowered his voice. "The board meeting has been moved to Friday. They insisted your schedule comes first." Ethan answered without missing a step. "Friday works better. Lily has her piano recital tomorrow evening, and I would not miss that for anything." Victoria remained standing beside the unsigned purchase offer, watching the two men disappear into the office. For the second time in less than a week, someone whose influence clearly extended far beyond ordinary business treated the small-town mechanic as though his time carried extraordinary value. The neat financial disclosure she had laughed at inside the courthouse suddenly felt incomplete, and for the first time she began to wonder whether the quiet man in the oil-stained work shirt had been hiding far more than a modest bank account. Victoria remained in her car for several minutes after leaving Brooks Auto Repair, watching through the windshield as Ethan walked back beneath the lifted Chevrolet and resumed tightening bolts as though a multi-million-dollar acquisition proposal had never crossed his workbench. She had negotiated with billionaire investors, persuaded stubborn board members, and outmaneuvered competitors twice her age, yet she could not remember the last time someone had declined one of her offers without even reading the first page. The silence unsettled her far more than an argument would have. Back at Hale Automotive Holdings, the afternoon board meeting filled the executive conference room. With charts, forecasts, and expansion maps spread across a 40-foot digital display, Vice President Daniel Mercer tapped the image of Brooks Auto Repair projected onto the screen. "We can increase annual service revenue by at least 30% if we replace that outdated facility with our premium model," he explained. Victoria folded her hands thoughtfully. "What do we know about the owner beyond public records?" Daniel shrugged. "Very little. He has operated the same garage for years, pays his taxes, keeps a clean reputation, and somehow has almost no debt. Nothing unusual." Victoria remembered the international banker addressing Ethan with unmistakable respect. "Look again," she said quietly. "Something does not fit." Within an hour, the company's research department began searching through business registrations, property records, charitable foundations, investment disclosures, and corporate filings. Every report returned the same answer. Ethan Brooks appeared to be exactly who he claimed to be. A divorced mechanic with a modest garage and an ordinary life. Yet none of the researchers could explain why influential people seemed eager to arrange their schedules around his availability. Late that afternoon, Victoria received another surprise. Charles Whitmore, the distinguished Ferrari owner, requested a private meeting regarding a restoration partnership between his automobile collection and Hale Automotive. She accepted immediately. When Charles entered her office the following morning, he admired the panoramic skyline for a moment before taking his seat. Their conversation began with classic automobiles, market trends, and collector demand before Victoria casually asked, "May I ask how long you have known Ethan Brooks?" Charles smiled with quiet affection. "Long enough to know that he fixes far more than engines." Victoria waited, expecting further explanation. Instead, Charles simply sipped his coffee. "He seems unusually respected," she continued. Charles nodded. Respect is earned one decision at a time. Is he wealthy? Victoria asked directly. Charles looked toward the window where sunlight reflected from the glass towers across downtown. The most valuable things a person owns rarely appear on financial statements. Victoria leaned forward. That was not my question. Charles smiled politely, but refused to elaborate. No, it was not. The conversation soon returned to automobiles. Yet Victoria noticed that every time Ethan's name surfaced, Charles answered with careful restraint, protecting something he clearly knew. 2 days later, another opportunity arrived unexpectedly. Hale Automotive sponsored a regional vocational scholarship ceremony at the local community college, and Victoria attended as keynote speaker. As she walked through the auditorium before the event began, she noticed several scholarship recipients gathering around a familiar figure near the front row. Ethan stood among them wearing the same simple mechanic's shirt beneath a clean sport coat, smiling as young students thanked him for believing in their futures. One young woman hugged him warmly before joining her family. Another proudly introduced him to her professors. None of the event banners listed Ethan as a donor or sponsor, yet everyone who approached him carried genuine gratitude rather than polite recognition. Victoria watched quietly from across the room, realizing she had judged an entire man using nothing more than a stained work shirt, a divorce filing, and a balance sheet that now seemed to reveal almost nothing about the life he had actually built. The scholarship ceremony ended just before sunset, and as families slowly filtered into the parking lot, Victoria remained standing beneath the wide stone entrance, unable to dismiss the quiet contradiction Ethan Brooks had become. Every report described an ordinary mechanic, yet every person who truly knew him spoke with the kind of gratitude that could not be purchased. She watched from a distance as Ethan knelt beside Lily, carefully straightening the ribbon she had received after performing at her school piano recital earlier that evening. Lily laughed as he brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and together they walked toward the same faded blue pickup truck that looked almost out of place among the luxury sedans surrounding the campus. There was no chauffeur, no security detail, no display of success. Only a father carrying his daughter's music folder while listening attentively as she described every note she had played. The following Monday, Brooks Auto Repair opened before sunrise as it always did. The morning air carried the familiar scent of rain drifting across warm pavement, while coffee steamed gently from a worn ceramic mug beside Ethan's toolbox. Shortly after 8 o'clock, an unfamiliar transport trailer eased into the parking lot carrying a beautifully preserved 1967 Shelby GT 500 worth more than most homes in the county. Ben Morales let out a low whistle. Who trusts a neighborhood garage with something like that? He asked quietly. The trailer door lowered, and the owner climbed out wearing casual clothes that did little to hide the confidence of someone accustomed to boardrooms rather than repair shops. He greeted Ethan with a firm handshake. I would not let anyone else touch her, he said warmly. Ethan smiled. Let us see what she is trying to tell us. For nearly an hour, he never reached for a computer or diagnostic scanner. He simply listened to the engine, rested his fingertips lightly against the valve cover, adjusted the timing by fractions that seemed almost invisible, and finally started the car once more. The deep rumble settled into a smooth, confident rhythm that filled the garage with unmistakable harmony. The owner closed his eyes and smiled. Perfect, he whispered. Exactly like it sounded 30 years ago. He handed Ethan an envelope before driving away. Ethan never opened it. Instead, he slipped it into the office safe beside a stack of sealed envelopes that looked remarkably similar. Across town, Victoria received another briefing from her research team. We still cannot find anything unusual, Daniel Mercer reported. His taxes are ordinary. His business records are ordinary. His property holdings are ordinary. Victoria leaned back thoughtfully. Then explain why collectors with 8-figure automobile collections wait weeks for appointments at his garage. No one answered. Later that afternoon, curiosity finally overcame her restraint. Without announcing herself, Victoria returned to Brooks Auto Repair just as another customer prepared to leave. This time it was not an expensive sports car, but an elderly couple driving a weathered Buick with nearly 300,000 miles on the odometer. The husband reached for his wallet, but Ethan gently pushed it back toward him. You already paid enough by serving this country for 30 years, he said with quiet respect. Drive safely, and bring me some of those homemade cookies your wife promised next month." The elderly woman smiled through grateful tears as they pulled away. Victoria noticed something that no financial statement had ever captured. Ethan charged luxury collectors full price without hesitation, yet he quietly reduced or forgave bills for struggling parents, retired veterans, and young families who simply needed another chance. The expensive envelopes disappearing into his office safe were not making him richer. They were allowing him to keep saying yes to people everyone else had already turned away. And for the first time, Victoria began to suspect that whatever secret Ethan was protecting had never been about hiding wealth from the world, but about making sure wealth never changed the man he had chosen to become. Victoria had built her career on one simple belief: every mystery could be solved if someone followed enough numbers. The following week, she instructed her private legal department to conduct one final review, this time going beyond ordinary financial records. Every public filing, every charitable organization, every corporate archive, every historical partnership connected to Ethan Brooks was carefully examined. Days passed with nothing unusual. Then, late on Thursday afternoon, an elderly records specialist quietly knocked on her office door, carrying a thin gray folder instead of the thick report she had expected. "This is all we found," he said. Victoria frowned as she opened it. Inside was only a single corporate document dating back nearly 20 years. It listed the creation of a private family investment trust that had later disappeared from public reporting. The founder's name had been partially sealed under a confidential court order, but one signature remained visible beneath the faded ink. "Ethan Brooks." Victoria looked up immediately. "Run the trust." The specialist shook his head. "We already tried. It no longer appears under any active ownership database." "Then who controls it now?" "That is the unusual part. We cannot identify a current owner because the assets were transferred into a perpetual private structure years ago. Everything after that is protected." Victoria stared silently at the page. For the first time, public records had not answered her questions. They had only created larger ones. The following morning, Charles Whitmore unexpectedly requested another meeting. This time he arrived carrying nothing except a weathered leather notebook. After exchanging brief greetings, he placed it gently on Victoria's desk. Inside were photographs spanning nearly 2 decades. Ethan standing beside high school graduates wearing scholarship medals. Ethan attending hospital fundraisers without standing near the cameras. Ethan sitting quietly in the back row during community award ceremonies while other people accepted recognition for programs he had financed anonymously. Victoria turned each page more slowly than the last. "Why are you showing me this?" she asked softly. Charles answered without hesitation. "Because you keep asking the wrong question." She looked at him with quiet confusion. "You want to know how much Ethan Brooks is worth. The better question is how many lives he has quietly invested in." Victoria lowered her eyes again. "Was he always wealthy?" Charles smiled gently. "Long ago, Ethan created something extraordinary with 2 close friends. When the company became successful, they wanted the spotlight. Ethan wanted peace. He sold his operational control, placed nearly everything into a private trust, and walked away before anyone started calling him a genius." Victoria remained silent. Charles continued. "He kept enough ownership to protect the people depending on him, but he chose a different life. He repaired engines because that work reminded him that broken things deserve patience instead of judgment." Victoria could hardly believe what she was hearing. "So the mechanic," Charles nodded, "is one of the wealthiest men I have ever known. Then why keep fixing cars?" Charles looked toward the city skyline beyond the office windows before answering. "Because money was never the dream. Freedom was." That evening, Victoria drove alone past Brooks Auto Repair. The garage lights still glowed warmly against the fading sunset. Through the open bay door, she watched Ethan helping Lily with her mathematics homework while waiting for fresh paint to dry on the hood of an old Chevrolet. A customer entered carrying a pie wrapped in a kitchen towel instead of a payment envelope. Ethan accepted it with genuine gratitude, smiling as though it were the finest gift he had received all week. Victoria remained parked across the street without saying a word. She finally understood that the greatest fortune Ethan Brooks had hidden from the world was not simply measured in dollars. It was the rare privilege of living exactly according to his values while never needing anyone's approval to prove his success. For the first time in many years, Victoria Hale canceled an executive dinner without offering an explanation. Instead of sitting beneath crystal chandeliers with investors, she drove through quiet neighborhoods until she found herself parked across the street from Brooks Auto Repair once again. The garage had already closed for the evening. Warm yellow light spilled through the office window while Ethan and Lily sat side by side at an old wooden table covered with school books, crayons, and a half-finished model airplane. There was no mansion hidden behind the garage, no luxury lifestyle waiting after business hours. When Lily solved a difficult math problem, Ethan smiled with unmistakable pride, and they celebrated by sharing 2 slices of homemade apple pie. Victoria remained inside her car longer than she intended, realizing she had spent years believing success always demanded a public display. Ethan possessed the freedom to prove exactly the opposite. The following morning she arrived at her headquarters carrying Charles Whitmore's notebook once again. Before the first board meeting began, she quietly instructed Daniel Mercer to suspend the acquisition of Brooks Auto Repair indefinitely. Daniel looked genuinely surprised. "The numbers still support the purchase," he reminded her. Victoria closed the folder without looking up. Not every decision should be made by numbers. The sentence surprised even her. Later that afternoon, another unexpected visitor appeared at her office. An elderly attorney named Richard Collins introduced himself as the longtime trustee representing the private family investment structure Ethan had established decades earlier. He carried no briefcase, only a slim envelope addressed personally to Victoria. "Mr. Brooks did not send me," Richard explained. "I am here because I heard your company has been asking questions. I believe there is something you deserve to understand." Victoria opened the envelope carefully. Inside were copies of charitable grant summaries, all approved anonymously through the trust. Rural hospitals, trade schools, veterans assistance programs, scholarships for single parents studying skilled trades, emergency repairs for struggling family businesses after natural disasters. Every donation had one thing in common. No public recognition had ever been requested. Victoria looked up slowly. "These total hundreds of millions of dollars." Richard nodded. "Closer to $1 billion over the years." She could hardly process the number. "Why remain anonymous?" Richard smiled gently. "Because gratitude changes when people believe generosity expects applause." He paused before continuing. "Many wealthy people ask how their names can appear on buildings. Ethan only asks whether children have warm classrooms and whether families can keep their homes." Victoria lowered her eyes once more. Memories from the courthouse returned with painful clarity. She remembered laughing quietly after reading his divorce disclosure. She remembered assuming his worn work shirt reflected the size of his life. She remembered believing that modest possessions meant modest value. Every assumption now felt painfully small. That evening, as the sun settled behind rows of maple trees outside Brooks Auto Repair, Ethan stood beside an elderly customer whose pickup truck had finally reached 400,000 miles. They laughed together while discussing baseball scores and fishing trips before Ethan handed back the keys. The grateful customer tried to offer an extra $100. Ethan politely declined. "Save it for your granddaughter's birthday," he said. "She will remember your time with her far longer than another repair bill." The old man smiled with quiet appreciation before driving away. Victoria watched from across the street once more, but this time there was no curiosity left in her expression, only respect. She finally understood why influential people adjusted their schedules around a mechanic who seemed to own almost nothing. They were not honoring the size of his fortune. They were honoring the size of his character. Because in a world where wealth often changed people, Ethan Brooks had accomplished something infinitely rarer. He had changed lives without allowing wealth to change him. Autumn arrived with crisp morning air and brilliant shades of gold spreading across the trees that lined Main Street. But inside the headquarters of Hale Automotive Holdings, the atmosphere felt unusually cold. Victoria stood at the head of the executive conference table as anxious voices filled the room. A major acquisition that had taken nearly 18 months to negotiate was beginning to collapse. International investors had withdrawn their support overnight after a key supplier unexpectedly entered financial restructuring, leaving billions of dollars in projected manufacturing contracts hanging in uncertainty. Every executive around the table spoke at once. One suggested filing emergency litigation. Another proposed selling valuable assets. A third warned that the company's stock could suffer lasting damage if confidence continued to weaken. Victoria listened quietly before raising one hand. The room fell silent. "How much time do we have?" she asked. Daniel Mercer glanced at the latest financial report. 48 hours before the lenders demand a revised recovery plan. The silence that followed carried more weight than any argument. For the first time since becoming chief executive officer, Victoria realized there was no obvious solution waiting inside another spreadsheet. Late that afternoon, she found herself driving toward the familiar brick garage she had once intended to replace. Brooks Auto Repair looked exactly as it always had. The service bays were open. The scent of fresh motor oil drifted into the cool afternoon air. Country music played softly from the old radio, while Ethan patiently explained a brake repair to a young college student who listened with complete attention. When the customer finally drove away, Victoria stepped inside. Ethan looked up, smiled politely, and set aside the wrench in his hand. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "What can I do for you today?" Victoria hesitated for a moment before answering. "I need advice." Ethan nodded toward two worn wooden chairs beside the office coffee pot. "Then let us sit down." There were no assistants taking notes, no lawyers preparing documents, no reporters waiting outside. Only two people sharing a quiet conversation while the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the familiar scent of polished steel. Victoria explained everything. The failed acquisition, the frightened investors, the uncertain future facing thousands of employees whose livelihoods depended on the company surviving the coming week. Ethan listened without interrupting, occasionally asking a simple question that revealed he understood far more about international business than any mechanic reasonably should. When she finally finished, he remained silent for several thoughtful seconds. "You are trying to save the transaction," he said gently. "Your employees are trying to save their future. Those are two different problems." Victoria looked at him with genuine curiosity. Ethan reached for a blank notepad lying beside the cash register and calmly drew 3 circles connected by simple lines. "Call these 3 suppliers first," he suggested. "Do not negotiate prices. Ask what they actually need to remain stable. Then introduce them to one another before tomorrow morning. They already have everything necessary to solve each other's shortages. They simply do not realize it yet." Victoria studied the names written neatly across the page. Every company belonged to a different state. Everyone had previously declined to work together because they viewed one another as competitors. "How do you know this?" she asked quietly. Ethan smiled with the same calm humility that had first puzzled her inside the courthouse weeks earlier. "Because good systems work exactly like healthy engines. Every part performs better when it stops competing with the others." Victoria carefully folded the page and slipped it into her notebook. "What do I owe you?" Ethan laughed softly. "Nothing." She looked surprised. "Advice like this could save my company." Ethan shrugged gently. "Then spend your energy protecting the people who depend on you instead of worrying about paying me back." Early the next morning, Victoria followed every recommendation exactly as Ethan had outlined. By noon, the 3 suppliers had reached an agreement no investment bank had even considered possible, stabilizing the manufacturing chain and restoring confidence across the entire project. As executives celebrated throughout headquarters, Victoria quietly looked at the folded sheet of paper resting on her desk and realized that the man who had just rescued a multi-billion-dollar deal had returned to his small garage before sunrise, where he was probably changing oil, rotating tires, and greeting every customer with exactly the same quiet dignity he had shown long before anyone understood who he truly was. The first snow of the season settled softly across Maple Street, covering rooftops, sidewalks, and the familiar parking lot outside Brooks Auto Repair with a quiet blanket of white. Inside the garage, warm light reflected across polished chrome, while the steady rhythm of hand tools mixed with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee. Ethan Brooks stood beside an aging Chevrolet pickup, patiently explaining a simple repair to its owner with the same calm honesty he had offered every customer for years. Nothing about his routine had changed. He still arrived before sunrise. He still swept the shop floor before opening the doors. He still placed Lily's newest school drawing beside the old coffee maker every Monday morning. Success had never altered his schedule because his schedule had never depended on success. Shortly before noon, a familiar black sedan pulled quietly into the parking lot. This time there were no attorneys, no acquisition documents, and no executives waiting behind tinted windows. Victoria Hale stepped out alone, carrying only a small paper bag from a neighborhood bakery. She paused outside the service bay for a brief moment before walking toward Ethan with an expression far different from the one she had worn inside the courthouse weeks earlier. Ethan looked up, smiled politely, and wiped his hands on a clean shop towel. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. "What brings you here today?" Victoria held out the paper bag with a gentle smile. "Apple pie. I heard it is your favorite." Ethan accepted it with quiet appreciation. "Thank you. Lily will be very happy." Victoria took a slow breath before speaking again. "There is something I should have said a long time ago." The garage grew unusually quiet. Even Ben instinctively stepped into the office, giving them privacy without being asked. Victoria looked directly at Ethan. "The first day I saw you, I believed your clothes, your garage, and your divorce papers told me everything about your life. I was completely wrong. I judged your circumstances instead of your character, and I laughed when I should have listened. I am truly sorry." Ethan remained silent for a moment, his expression calm and thoughtful. Finally, he smiled with genuine kindness. "We all see the world through whatever experiences have shaped us. What matters is whether we are willing to keep learning." Victoria nodded slowly, humbled by the grace of his response. "Most people would have reminded me how badly I treated them." Ethan glanced toward Lily, who was happily finishing homework at the office table. "If I spent my life collecting apologies, I would never have enough time to collect moments like that." Victoria followed his gaze and smiled softly. The little girl looked up, waved enthusiastically, and returned to her homework without knowing she had just become part of a conversation neither adult would ever forget. A few days later, Hale Automotive Holdings announced a new nationwide apprenticeship program for young mechanics, funded through a partnership with several anonymous charitable organizations. The official press release never mentioned Ethan Brooks by name because he had quietly requested that every scholarship belong to the students rather than the people supporting them. Months passed, and the program helped hundreds of young men and women begin meaningful careers. Brooks Auto Repair remained exactly where it had always been. Customers continued arriving with old trucks, family sedans, and treasured classic cars. Wealthy collectors still waited patiently for appointments, while struggling families still found unexpected kindness when life became difficult. Every evening, Ethan locked the garage, climbed into the same faded blue pickup truck, and drove home with Lily beside him, listening to her stories about school and laughing at jokes only the two of them completely understood. Victoria occasionally stopped by with coffee or homemade desserts, not to discuss investments or business strategies, but simply to enjoy honest conversation with someone who had quietly changed the way she measured success. She eventually realized that the greatest lesson she had learned was not that a mechanic had secretly possessed an extraordinary fortune. It was that genuine wealth had never been hidden inside bank accounts, investment trusts, or business empires. It had always been visible in every act of patience, every quiet kindness, every second chance offered without expectation, and every life made better by a man who never needed recognition to know exactly who he was. In the end, the courthouse laughter faded into memory, the balance sheets became forgotten paperwork, and the expensive titles lost their importance. But the quiet dignity Ethan carried every single day remained the one treasure that no market could ever value and no amount of money could ever replace.